Okay, maybe I could start now. So good morning, everybody. My name is Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly, and I am the director of the European Studies research part of our research program. And we started this lecture series this year. We're going to have 6 lectures this year. This is number 2. We have a third one in November, and then we'll have one in January, one in February, and one in March. And if you want to have the details, you should go back to our webpage. You look at UVic European Studies, and you look at the lecture series and click on it, and you'll have all the details. Today, we are lucky enough to have Oliver Schmidtke, who's the director of the Center for Global Studies at the University of Victoria. He's a professor of political science and history. Some of you know him well, some don't. He's been the Jean Monnet chair. He's been president of the Association for European Studies Canada. He's published numerous books and many more articles, and he's a very active on in the media and on TV. Most of his research is on migration in Europe. He's published numerous books on the topic. And today we are, I'm really pleased that he offered to do this. He's going to talk to us about the rise of populism and the threat to liberal democracy in Europe, which is a big topic, and is also part of a large research program that he's had and has been funded by the European Jean Monnet programs. One small item that I want to add to this is that you should keep your microphone and possibly your videos muted, at least your microphone muted during the presentation, which will last about 30-35 minutes. And then we have time for questions. And you should use the chat box to signal that you want to ask a question. And then Amanda, who monitors the chat box and monitors the recording of the conference, will be able to give you the floor so you can ask your question and Oliver respond. And with this, Oliver, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, and thanks, Amanda, for setting this up. And welcome, everybody. It's a sunny afternoon, at least here in Victoria, so all the more I'm grateful that you spend your time on another Zoom meeting. And you might have your mind on the American election, American politics at the moment, more so than on what is happening in the old continent. But I hope with my presentation, I can give you some ideas of how to interpret and how to, in a way, get closer to an assessment of the interesting times we're living through with respect to the state of liberal democracy. I will now start sharing my screen here with you. I'm bringing up my PowerPoint presentation. Give me 1 second here. So let me start here, and let me briefly let you know what I'm going to do for the next 30-35 minutes or so. I would like to put this presentation into a broader context, which will assess where we are at with respect to representative democracy. And you can already see my underlying hypothesis interpreting the rise of populism, mainly from the right, which is that it speaks to an underlying tendency in our current form of democracy, which has been challenged and has been questioned for very good reasons. So the rise of populism will be conceptualized by me in a way as a mirror image of the state of current liberal democracy. It speaks to its shortcomings, and clearly it is, right-wing populism is driven by a frustration with contemporary forms of democratic governance. So starting with a broader historic introduction, I will give you some very brief sense of how to conceptualize populism. As a political scientist, I always have to come up with some kind of definition, but I think it is, even more pertinent with respect to today's topic, as populism is indeed fundamentally challenged in terms of what it represents and how to best define it. And then I give you a sense of what is driving populism and how it speaks to current challenges in liberal democracy. And in the end, I come to an assessment, mainly with respect to what's happening in Europe, whether we do see indeed a deep crisis of democratic governance at the moment, and how the rise of populism speaks to this. So that's the agenda. Let me briefly go back here. I put this picture up on my first slide, The Revenge of History, and probably you're all aware that it speaks to Francis Fukuyama's hypothesis about 30 years ago of the end of history. And I just want to take you briefly back to the state 89, 1990 in Europe, where there was a great degree of optimism about the spread of democracy. Communism had crumbled in Central Eastern Europe. The expansion of the kind of Western cultural, but also political model into parts of the world that hadn't seen democratic rule, if ever in the history, or at least not in much of the 20th century. So this sense of optimism, which Fukuyama then described basically under certain ideological premises as the end of history, as liberal, market-driven form of governance being the ultimate stage of our government, of organizing our political community. Clearly, we have seen a lot of change, and that's The Revenge of History, I think, quite nicely captures this element that what we thought would be an expansion and a solidification of democratic rule in those parts of Europe that hadn't seen it for a long time has turned, at least in certain circumstances, into a veritable threat to the stability of these democratic regimes. And I would like to briefly go to a book that was published in 2013, but really Peter Mayer, who taught at the European University Institute already in the 2000s, was very concerned about the state of democracy. I still remember when I went back to the UI where I did my doctoral degree, I couldn't quite share his pessimism. And he published this book after he passed away, Ruling the Void. And he talked in very vivid terms about the hollowing out of democracy, that what we expect democracy to do, to have a demos, a sovereign who decides through a particular set of institutions, that this very notion had been challenged at this stage already, and that we were going through a period of fundamental changes in how these liberal democracies operate. And he predicted how these institutions would lose much of their authority, how there would be a growing indifference of the population towards the very notion of what democratic rule is all about in terms of procedures, the parliament, the political parties, a decline of trust in parties and what we consider to be major institutional arrangements for making democracy work. And maybe, he was a bit too early in telling us about the hollowing out of democracy, but in a way, what we see today could be interpreted at least as an important step in this respect. And we see this across the world, the relative success of authoritarian rule that sometimes comes formally with elections, but often it is with a great degree of disrespect what genuine democracy means. And the concerning part for our lecture today, looking at Europe and within the context of European studies, is also that this comes not only as an external threat to European democracies, but within the European Union itself. Here you see two examples, Poland and Hungary, where we see this veritable threat to the integrity of democratic institutions and rule at work, part to undermining the judiciary, curtailing free media. I'm going to come back to this towards the end of my presentation. If we put this into a historic perspective for one moment, you could say maybe this is blown out of proportion. Really, what we've seen over throughout the 20th into the 21st century, we should be more optimistic, right? This is just a very broad overview of the extension of democratic rule into parts of the world. And clearly you can see here, maybe Fukuyama was right when he predicted the expansion of liberal democracy as the remaining or legitimate form of governments. Indeed, there has been this spread. But, and this is, you have a different depiction here. We have seen democracy as it has grown around the world, in particular in Central Eastern Europe. But you can also probably already assess that this might be an overly optimistic account. Clearly, we have seen the introduction of democratic rule in many of those countries. And at the same time, and that is maybe the paradox that we are facing at the moment, we see this expansion of democratic rule and institutions into other parts of the world, prominently Europe here with respect to its expansion of the European Union to Central Eastern Europe. And at the same time, it seems that what constitutes democracy, what is at the very core of providing a venue for the sovereign, the people to articulate and be meaningfully integrated into the decision-making process, has become at least doubtful. And maybe this is quite interesting for those of you with an interest in Europe, that, according to the Economist study here, the best and worst countries for democracy, you can see here European countries faring relatively well in terms of the maturity and the quality of democracies. You can see here the United States, 21. You wonder where, after the presidency of President Trump, where they might end up, in terms of the stability and quality of democratic rule. But that's just a snapshot that shows you that, in particular in Europe, it seems things are relatively stable and well established. Maybe going through this very broad overview before focusing more closely in Europe, you can also see, and that might be a first indication of coming to the core of the paradox that I described to you. We see this expansion of democracy around the world, but those full democracies clearly are under threat. There's backsliding in some countries that have reverted to democracy. There is, a decline in the quality of democratic rule to a certain extent, at least. Now, this is just at a global level, an indication of something's not working the way that the optimist might have predicted with the collapse of communism and going into the 1990s at the time. This is a study by the Pew Center that gives you an indication of some of the tendency that we see playing out in North America, but also in Europe. So you can see here in this broad survey that there's still a 3/4 majority of people say representative democracy is a good form of governance that we want to keep. But if you go then along, you see there's a strong support for other additional forms of direct democracy, an indication that democratic practice only through representative institutions, such as party politics, parliament, and so forth, is often seen to be missing and deficient. And there is a great degree of appetite that might be surprising to see for the rule by experts that are allegedly superior to elected representatives, and at least amongst about 1/4 of the population, a stronger desire for rule by a strong leader or even rule by the military. That might be surprising in democratic countries to see this kind of desire for a strong man. And here you just see this according to countries. And you might not be surprised to see that, for example, in Hungary, the the endorsement of the idea of military leadership or strong expert leadership, strong leadership is quite widespread. And this opens at least the door for challenges to our established liberal democracy in this respect. You can see here some other countries, not too surprising, maybe with the UK, you see quite some openness here. Or at least, it's not always that with respect to the 20th century, I can be so proud of my home country, Germany, but at least there seems to be some limited desire to endorse these kind of options in this respect. Here is, support for a strong leader. You see this particularly strongly articulated in those countries that have introduced liberal democracy only after the collapse of communism. In countries like Hungary, Slovenia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, there is a great degree of openness towards or seeing it as important to have a strong leader, strong authoritarian or authoritative leadership that could easily slip into a form of populist politics, as I will describe it in a moment. So this sets in a way the agenda. Not the direction toward mature democracy, but rather increasing doubts about the viability of democratic institutions and an underlying desire for alternative forms of governance that could also rely on strong leadership, direct democracy outside of the realm of established democratic institutions. And that translates into this relative success of right-wing populism in Europe. I'm not sure, you probably can't see this properly. This is where the yellow or orange ones are, where those parties are already in some kind of coalition government. Italy should be taken out of this. It's a bit dated, but it shows you the relative success of right-wing populist parties in particular, but not exclusively, in Central Eastern Europe. So already the suggestion that it might have to do with a transformation away from communism, long-term legacy of authoritarian rule, and the volatility of democratic transformation, in particular in this part of Europe that is relatively new to the community of democratic states on the continent. And here you see the enormous increase in the electoral success of right-wing populist or nationalist parties. I'm going to come to this distinction in a second here. You can see here throughout the 1980s, it was primarily, almost exclusively, the Front National setting the agenda and being the first articulation of this new political force in liberal democracies. But the Front National has been joined by a host of different political parties that have really challenged the status quo in many countries, sometimes in very dramatic ways, sometimes replacing old parties. If you think about the political landscape, let's say in Italy, if you came out of a coma over the last 10 years and were confronted with party politics in Italy, you wouldn't even recognize many of the actors on the ground. You have entirely new parties. Think about the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, for the first time since the Second World War, joining and being elected into federal parliament. You can go basically through those different countries and be surprised and maybe also worried about the extent of the relative success of these parties. Now, with this obviously not too brief an introduction, let me move to what the critical dimensions of this populism is, and in trying to focus always on the underlying hypothesis about the volatility, if not crisis, of democratic rule that they're addressing. Probably the most critical element of populism is its anti-establishment impetus. That what populist parties do very cunningly and very effectively is to build the case in which they represent themselves to be the voice of those people who have been silent, not heard, those who challenge the establishment of an irresponsible elite that supposedly is betraying the true interest of the people. The idea of popular sovereignty, the rule of the people, the vox populi, that goes to the very heart of what democracy is, right? To have the people to be the sovereign in the decision over the collective affairs. Populists are quite good at portraying themselves to be in this underdog position and to claim to, in a way, regain the sovereignty of those who've been betrayed by economic elites, by political elites, by the establishment. And it's quite interesting to see that how the populists claim they need some form of who they represent, who is the people, who do they represent to politically speak on behalf of. And often what we have is a very strong sense of us versus them. That could be coded, and that's already an important point I'm going to elaborate on in a second here, is populism is different from nationalism, as they have a kind of a vertical hierarchy. They built on a vertical hierarchy between the ordinary people and the political and economic elite. So a hierarchy, a vertical axis here. At the same time, they draw also on the ideological toolkit, if you want to call it this way, of nationalism, that have a more horizontal sense of us versus them, defined in cultural, ethnic terms, the kind of nationalist community that needs to be protected. So the sense of America first, or as you can see here, France, make France great again, the Netherlands great again, the same kind of rhetoric. It seems it speaks to the traditional nationalist sense of closing off the borders, and border politics plays an important role in this respect. But it marries what you have in populist is bringing together these two critical elements, the hierarchical sense of fighting the establishment on behalf of the ordinary people, and then protecting the integrity, the identity of the people, often defined in terms of the nation state. So what populism does, and if you think about democratic rule, is that they claim to speak on behalf of the people in a direct, unmediated, unconstitutionalized form. And that's important because it draws on the frustration of people who feel they've lost their voice. And that is, if you think about the environment in which populism as a political force thrives, it is very much with respect to those people who feel they have lost this ability to speak in a direct, unmediated way or be represented by a leader in this particular way. And it is not by accident that we see these rallies. You wonder, why does Trump always go out and meet his people, so to speak, his supporters? You have this in the US, but also, here with respect to Matteo Salvini, leader of the Lega party. He tortured poor Italians, not last in summer of 2019. He always showed up on the beaches and staging these rallies. It is the underlying sense that you need to stage the immediate connection to the people, to give voice to the people, even through gathering in the piazzas. This form of political communication and representation that is so different from the constitutional order of party politics, the arcane rules of the parliamentary system that has frustrated many people and felt they have been excluded from having this kind of political voice. So this sense of direct representation, even through charismatic leaders that speak on behalf of the people and in their name, representing the sovereign people, is a very powerful tool that challenges established modes of democracy. Now, sorry for this rather text-heavy slide. I'm going to come back to some illustrations in a second here. So I have to hurry up a little bit. So what I try to point out here is, it's not by accident that we see in populism the fusion of two ideas. The claim to represent the virtuous and homogeneous people as populism suggests to be the vox populi, the direct articulation of the will of the people, and then in a way tie this to the sovereigntist narrative that you see in traditional nationalist terms. So Marine Le Pen is a very good example of this. She speaks often in terms of return to our sovereignty, basically give back the voice to the people. The sovereign then often understand and regularly understood as the national community, where immigrants, ethnocultural others have no place. So you can see here the exclusionary logic of nationalist ideology and the vertical notion of challenging the establishment fuse in this kind of sovereigntist idea that you have as a driving force behind populism. And it clearly speaks to notions of insecurity. I'm going to come to this, both in terms of economic status, but also identity. So it is not by accident that the rise of, in particular, right-wing populism coincides with yet another dynamic in the globalization or Europeanization of societies, where you have an increasingly important degree of challenges of what it means to be Dutch, Italian, French, German, and so forth. So, and you have the dynamic of a globalizing world, the need to be connected to the knowledge that comes with it, that challenges traditional communities in this respect. And what you see here is the border plays an important role in the rhetoric of those populist actors. They describe the European Union of undermining the integrity of nation states, of putting into danger these borders, and it is not by accident also directed against immigrants. So if you try to understand where some of the opportunities for these right-wing populists come from, clearly, if you go back to 2015-16, the relatively opening of the borders for refugees coming from the South, that speaks and fuels, in a way, the rhetoric that we see from right-wing populists. So let me move to my third point here. What are the opportunities that we see throughout Europe for fueling right-wing populism and addressing also some of the challenges that we see in democracy? The first one is, as I already started to tell you, the hollowing out of democracy has left a void, a lack of trust in established institutions and its actors. And I'm going to come back to this slide in a second here. There clearly is a growing concern about what the democratic process is able to deliver. If you talk to younger people, the degree of cynicism towards democracy is very palpable. And what we've taken for granted every 4 years, we organize elections, we leave it to our elected representative and parliament to make democracy work, has clearly seen a growing doubt in the wider population. This is a survey from the Pew Center again about dissatisfaction with democracy throughout Europe. And you can see here how widespread and deep the dissatisfaction with established democratic rules are. They go up into the, in the high 70s or 60s or lower 70s here. So over half of the population often is dissatisfied or frustrated with how democracy works. So if you think about the term, I think, which is quite appropriate that Peter Mayer framed, the hollowing out of democracy, there is something that no longer works to make democracy work. Indications are the loss of trust in institutions, political party membership. I already indicated how fundamentally changed the landscape of parties is in Europe, but also how these parties lose members, how younger people in particular no longer see any incentive to join parties as the alleged representatives of the will of the people. So I think although we still refer to Europe as a set of relatively stable democracies, underneath the surface, there's a growing frustration with and dissatisfaction with our established democratic institutions. Now, the second point here, as a driving force, the rise of social inequality and uncertainty, downward pressure on the middle class. I think if you consider what we see at the moment in American politics, for many people, the whole idea of the American dream, middle class, rising in terms of prosperity and so forth, is no longer a feasible option. And it's quite interesting to, again, take an historic look at income shares in Europe and the US. And basically what we see here is the US is essentially back in terms of the top decile income share to where it was in 1900. An enormous increase in social inequality in American society, but also to a certain extent in some European countries. Not too surprisingly, a more radically market-oriented society such as the UK, with a less solid form of a welfare state, shows more similar patterns to the US ones, whereas continental European countries are a bit more modest in terms of the increase in this income inequality. And here you have, again, the bottom 15% in the US and in Europe, in Western Europe, and the top 1%. And you can just see that Europe is similar in its overall pattern. It's not quite at the level of increase in social inequality compared to where the US is at the moment. And clearly, there is a link between the state of the globalized economy and what I describe here as the challenge to a traditional social contract. The naive belief in 98, 1990 that once we have free market global capitalism, that would bring liberal democracy to all parts of the world. You might recall when we discussed at the time, the older ones amongst you, when we discussed China, that's all right, if they open up to the kind of globalized market economy, there will be a push towards liberal reform as well. There was this great sense of optimism. Clearly, that hasn't worked in this respect. Rather, the hypothesis could be that deregulated capitalism over the last 20, 30 years has contributed to many people having a doubt in the validity and legitimacy of the traditional social contract. So it is not easy to make this direct link. And I just want to caution you here, because sometimes in this rather oversimplified way, we hear those people supporting right-wing populism in particular, they're the losers of globalization. They are those that suffer the most in socioeconomic terms. That's not quite the case. I think we have now relatively robust sociological studies that indicate that it is often the declining middle class, the fear of social decline, then the relative exposure to poverty, to social decline that drives the allegiance and the support for these right-wing populists. I don't really have the time, let me just check, to go into much of this. This is a preliminary study that I did that has been published, if you want to look it up, in Frontiers in Sociology at the beginning of this term, this year, where I just tried to assess the sentiments and the political ideologies of supporters of the AfD in Germany. And clearly there was a deep sense of marginalization and alienation from established politics. But there's no direct link really between socioeconomic deprivation, so loss of income, unemployment rates, and so forth, and the frustration with the political system. There's both. It's a kind of sense of economic threat, but as well in a very strong way. What I found, there's a fundamental sense of cultural marginalization. It is not only economically being disadvantaged, but also the non-recognition and disrespect that these people feel towards the intellectual elites, the universities, the media, the scientists, those that are linked into a kind of a global discourse, that are part of the chattering class and so forth, there was a deep sense of loss of cultural recognition and also the identity that they had in their traditional neighborhoods and communities. So I think if you try to understand slogans like "Make America Great Again," you could laugh about it and say, yeah, what is he talking about? But really there is a strong desire for visualizing a kind of romanticized past that in a way counterbalances this deep sense of marginalization in economic but also cultural terms that is driving much of the support for right-wing populism. Right, I don't have time to go into the details of this study. I'd rather go and leave some room for questions. I have two more points here that what is driving the rise of right-wing populists. The third one is the crisis of the social democratic left that has failed widely to offer convincing counter-narrative towards those that say representative democracy can't really represent you properly. We give you a sense of community that could counter the more nationalist, exclusionary rhetoric of right-wing populists. And it is quite astonishing to see, if you see the decline of the left and social democratic left in Europe, there's a clear tendency throughout much of Europe. There always, now we have a socialist government again in Spain, so always some other tendencies, but in general, you see a sharp decline in the political fortunes of social democracy, in particular since New Labour came along and rebranded socialist/social democratic parties across the European landscape, moving them more into the center and representing a different clientele. And those who feel left behind, working class people, not belonging to a kind of cultural elite or well-educated. If you think about the constituency of right-wing populists, they no longer feel often represented by those parties that traditionally have claimed to be the spokesperson for the more marginalized and less privileged. I think that was Politico, that came up with this great headline, "Who Killed European Social Democracy?" just describing how dramatic the decline in the electoral fortunes of social democracy really is. And I think there is a recognition that social democracy hasn't been able to come up with a convincing narrative that would address those concerns of people who feel simply left behind, not heard, and betrayed by whatever political and economic elite you might have. And that's concerning that there is no, if you want to call it, progressive force that could articulate those kind of concerns in a more convincing fashion. Do we go, and let me briefly come to my last point here and wrap things up so we can engage in a discussion. Do we really see a crisis of liberal democracy with a view to the resurgence of populist right-wing groups? I would suggest, and I hope I made this clear by introducing my session, that I see populism from the right, but also from the left, as a form of agonistic politics that is often seen as a reflection of inherent weakness in our form of representative democracy. They address forms of a lack of proper representation through these institutions that many people feel. So in a way, the rise of populism is an indication of a crisis of democracy in terms of its institutional arrangements and ways of representing the people. So when these right-wing populists claim, we give back the power to the people. And in the German context, it's quite, I think, revealing and fascinating to see that right-wing populists have adopted the slogan of the opposition against the communist regime, "We are the people." So claiming that we speak on behalf of the people that are being ruled by some form of authoritarian rule. I think that is to be kept in mind, that in populism, it is very it would be misleading, let me put it like this, to contrast populism as the illiberal opposition against democratic rule, and then you have a perfect liberal democracy with functioning institutions. Rather, what we see is that populism and populist actors have filled a certain void and have addressed issues with how democracy operates and how it lives up to its promise to represent the people in a meaningful way. Nonetheless, there clearly is a strong tendency of illiberalism in at least what right-wing populists have to offer. They claim to empower the people to reimagine what a governed by the people would look like, but often it is by relying on a strong figure, on a charismatic leadership that then, in a form of symbiosis almost, can claim to directly and immediately to represent the will of the people. And that is clearly to the disadvantage of established forms of checks and balances, of institutional rules, of constitutional arrangements that we have in this respect. I'm going to come back to this in a second. This is just an idea of how Viktor Orban, in an important speech, once described democracy and his idea of democracy. That he says, democracy doesn't have to be liberal in terms of division of labor between different key institutions, the independence of the judiciary, but rather what he has in mind is to reinvent democracy that would look very different from our traditional ways of envisioning this democracy. So, he in a way tries to implement on a state level, now having the power that he has constitutionally, to, in a way, move away democracy from its liberal iteration to something that, we'll see exactly what those forms will take. But he said there is a superior form of organizing democracy in this respect. And that clearly is reflected in the Freedom House reports on Hungary, where it comes to the electoral process, independent media, civil society, independence of civil society. There are very clear indications, judicial independence, forms of corruption, that all those indicators with which we use to measure and judge the state of liberal democracy are under threat in a country such as Hungary. Poland looks a bit better, but you have similar tendencies. So what you see here are inherent illiberal tendencies in those countries where we have these right-wing populists in government. Clearly, and I think I don't have to tell you, if you're watching the American electoral campaign, but also going through Europe, populism has an inert tendency to thrive on political polarization. They constantly have to, in a way, keep the narrative of us versus them, us, the ordinary people, the corrupt elite up there alive. And if you're so, in a way, ideologically committed to keeping this narrative of a constant threat to the integrity of the own community, of branding enemies of the people as those threatening their identity, its identity and its interest, you can see how this easily slips into a more xenophobic, anti-minority political rhetoric and practice. So there is this inherent illiberal tendency with respect to minorities, to immigrants, and so forth. Now, maybe one last point I can see. I'm coming to the end of my session here. What we see is, and that is maybe if you look at the first point here, populism is some kind of corrective to representative democracy. A reminder that democracy might be more than some of the established institutional arrangements that we have. We have to be careful, because what we see once populists get into government, Their promise of democratic empowerment of the people often leads to a form of state clientelism and corruption, which means that the party feels entitled to take over the state as a mechanism, as a tool in promoting its interest. And it becomes less and less accountable to some form of established forms of division of power between institutions and the state. And we see this, and it's not by accident, that in countries where we have populist forces in government, the independent judiciary, independent media, oversight of parliament and parliamentary power are severely curtailed. So while I say populism is a kind of corrective, an indication of a considerable crisis of democratic rule, I also want to caution that what they have to offer often leads to the further erosion of these democratic principles by the very nature of how populists often envision the representation of the people on whose behalf they claim to act. All right, Amanda, I leave it here and I'm happy to take questions. I'm not sure how many people we are in the virtual room. Let me see, I can stop sharing now. I think some of you have turned on the camera. If you feel like using your camera when you ask a question, that'll be great.
We have a number of questions in the chat.
Already? Okay.
Before I stop the recording, I just want to let everyone know that Ben's presentation will be next month on the 24th. Benjamin Perrier. So feel free to join us for that, and I will send the link to the chat.
Okay, should I?
All right, 1 second, I'll just end the recording.